Welcome to the podcast of Mann Library's Chats in the Stacks Book Talk series. Today's talk, originally presented on February 7, 2006, is Food Aid After 50 Years, Recasting Its Role by Cornell professor Chris Barrett. Professor Barrett draws from his new book, recently quoted by the New York Times and other major newspapers, on the history and real impact of U.S. aid practices in Africa and other countries. American food aid relief, argues Professor Barrett, is much less effective than it could be. Simple changes could make big improvements, but big economic stakes make any change in the current food aid regime far from easy.
Thank you, Susan. Well, thank you all for coming out here. Boy, this is loud. Sorry, I'm not used to being so wired up. It's really a pleasure to get to talk in front of one's kind of home crowd, so to speak. I've given versions of this talk several other places, including last week in some congressional staff briefings, where not everybody is quite as hospitable as I suspect most of you will be. So this is fun. The core issue that this book concerns is what's the relationship between a Cargill flour mill like this one on the Mississippi River in Minnesota and these refugees who I photographed in their tents on the shore in Sri Lanka after the tsunami. So what's the relationship between these two seemingly quite disparate groups of people? This book is written with Dan Maxwell, a longtime friend. We were graduate students together at Wisconsin. Dan is the deputy director for the Eastern and Central Africa region for CARE International and has been the point person spearheading most NGO operations in Darfur, Sudan, for example. So the photo on the cover of our book is a photo that his assistant took with him in Darfur shortly before we published the book. What I'd like to do in this talk is just to walk through a few of the basic and especially the more contentious issues that we tackle in the book and some of the myths that we try to explode about food aid policy and its role and its efficacy and some of the implications for American food aid policy. As it happens, this is quite timely. Just yesterday, the President released his fiscal year 2007 budget and proposes several major reforms to U.S. food aid programs directly consistent with some of the recommendations we've made. That's why I was down in Washington last week doing these staff briefings for the Senate and the House in anticipation of what they're about to start battling over. So some of these issues I'll try to highlight, in particular how it's salient in the immediate domestic political arena. So I think the crucial first step, however, is to frame the issue. Why is a development economist, somebody who's concerned about food security and poverty and natural resources, why am I worrying about food aid? Why am I worrying about Cargill flour mills on the Mississippi River? And the simple answer is that, and unfortunately this is not framing particularly well, but the simple answer is that the first Millennium Development Goal espoused by the global community of nations through the UN is to have poverty and hunger by the year 2010. And if we are going to have the proportion of people living on less than $1 a day, living in extreme poverty, and have the number of people who suffer from hunger, we need policy instruments that work, that effectively target the poor, and that really reach the poor in ways that help them both to be able to build the assets that they use to generate incomes in the future, and to sustain them to prevent excessive nutrient deprivation in the short term. Food aid, Dan and I argue, is critical for that purpose. Food aid is critical for that purpose for really a couple of simple reasons. First is that it meets a very basic human right, as enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights from 1948. I mean, Article 25 is very explicit that all humans have a right to food. In time of extreme emergencies, that right to food isn't commonly met, and there is a corresponding obligation, at least on the part of sovereign states, to meet individuals' rights to food. And many of us would argue that there are corresponding obligations to the international community to assist especially poor states in meeting those human rights to food. So the first critical role of food aid is in just satisfying basic human rights. But there are other critical things, other critical roles food aid can play, especially in protecting assets. Most important asset for the poor is their own labor power, so preserving human health Growing evidence suggests that ill health is the single leading cause of people's collapse into long-term poverty. So a short adverse health episode doesn't necessarily send people into a downward spiral, but a severe health shock, such as those caused by extreme undernutrition, and a particularly extreme undernutrition experience early in childhood, can be catastrophic for future earnings and well-being. The key thing, the real take-home point of the book, and the thing that gets us in some trouble with part of the food aid community, is the emphasis that food aid is a complement to other resources. Nobody survives on bread alone. One routinely finds even demonstrably malnourished people. I mean, children suffering marasmus and kwashiorkor are outside refugee camps selling part of their food aid ration. It's a very common occurrence, simply because they need things other than just food. They need medicine, want to pay for school fees, what have you. And so the idea is food is part of a package of what people need. And when the resources that we dedicate to relieving human suffering come only in one form, they're guided by the supply of the resource rather than the needs of the recipients, then we wind up having a system that doesn't perform to its capabilities. And that's what Dan and I are trying to push. We're trying to push for reform to realize the potential of food aid as an instrument in the challenge of meeting the first Millennium Development Goal. So we need to embed food aid in a development strategy rather than trying to fit development strategies to meet the availability of a resource created for other reasons that I'll describe in a couple of minutes. The key here, as I've already foreshadowed, is that the efficacy of food aid in meeting its humanitarian and development goals really depends on how tightly focused food aid is on those goals. Are we providing food to the people who need it when they need it in a form that's useful, or are we instead simply liquidating surplus resources through politically well-connected providers of processed foods, of shipping services, etc., and thereby distorting the delivery of food so that it doesn't reach people when they need it, doesn't reach the people who need it, etc.? The answer is a bit of both. There's both a recipient need-driven component to food aid, and unfortunately, and especially within the United States, a donor interest-driven side to food aid programming. And what we're trying to work towards is breaking the supply side drivers behind the food aid system, because, as I'll argue shortly, they don't work at advancing donor objectives other than humanitarian and development objectives. I'll come back to those claims in a minute. So ultimately, there are key issues around when you have a tight budget constraint. That's what this says off the side of the screen. One needs to use resources efficiently. That's primarily an issue of how do we write the rules surrounding food aid procurement and distribution. Some of you may have seen in the press over the last several months, there's a big battle that's resuming again with the new budget over whether the U.S. Will have the authority to begin to buy food in developing countries, or whether we have to source it all from the U.S., as present law stipulates. The other issues, which I won't touch on nearly as much, surround operational agencies. NGOs like CARE, or Catholic Relief Services, the United Nations World Food Program, which is the largest distributor of food in the world. Those agencies have a host of different operational details that are important to think about as well, but I just won't spend much time on those given the time pressures of this talk. Let me provide a very quick history of food aid just so that you understand some of where this has come from, and in particular some of the problems we encounter in the political discourse around food aid today, because people remember food aid as it existed 20 or 30 years ago. So food aid as we know it today is basically a product of the 1950s. In 1954, July 10th, 1954, President Eisenhower signed Public Law 480, which created the programs we know today known as PL 480, which to this day continue to represent a majority of global food aid. Up until the early 70s, American and Canadian food aid represented better than 90% of global food aid. Those food aid flows were the direct byproduct of price support programs in North America for farmers. The United States government set a floor price for wheat, for corn, for a variety of products. The Canadians did the same. And so when the market would begin to fall, because there were abundant harvests, stocks were reasonably plentiful, prices would fall and the government would step in to mop up the surplus. It then is expensive to hold big warehouses full of grain or skim milk powder, so it looked for a place to dump those surpluses. But you don't want to dump the surplus right back into the market or you drive the price right back down. So the surplus disposal mechanism of choice is to put the surpluses beyond the market shed, to put them into poor countries that weren't part of the global market for the commodities in question. And so that's the basic design of the original food aid programs. They were surplus disposal programs, driven by the existence of price supports that caused government-held stocks of major commodities in North America. That's changed over time for the primary reason that we no longer run those same price support programs. So we don't have mountains of government-held commodities that we need to dispose of overseas. But the basic architecture of the programs, the basic motivations of the programs as enshrined in the most recent Farm Bill legislation, 2002, 1990, et cetera, continue very much along the lines of what we saw in 1954. Now, starting with the so-called world food crisis of 73, 74, the European community began to step in to global food aid. And the World Food Program became a major actor as the big donors, essentially what are today the EU countries, Canada and the United States, along with Australia back then, they realized that they needed to coordinate their activities. So the World Food Program began to lead much of the operational side of global emergency response. The other thing that's been going on, besides this evolution of the donor sourcing of commodities that it was underpinned by price supports that no longer exist, is food aid has always been a contentious issue in the trade realm. For the reason I mentioned before, if you dump the food into the marketplace, it pushes prices down. It displaces commercial purchases of food, and it drives prices down for those who are still selling their food. So when PO 480 was created in 1954, the global community set up a parallel system to monitor food aid, to ensure that it didn't disrupt global markets for commodities. So something called the Consultative Subcommittee for Surplus Disposal, the names are very revealing, established within the Committee on Commodity Problems, another revealing title, of the UN Food and Agriculture Organization. The CSSD was created as a group that would monitor food aid flows. Donors were obliged to report the food aid flows they were planning to ship so that all of the global community of food exporters could rest assured that this was indeed in response to an emergency or it was well programmed to meet the needs of a population that wasn't really in the marketplace, and therefore this wasn't going to be trade distorting. So CSSD existed to try to ensure that food would be targeted for humanitarian and development purposes and not be trade disrupting. As I'll describe shortly, it's utterly ineffective today, and that's a big reason why one of the most acrimonious battles in Hong Kong in December at the WTO ministerial was over food aid. The EU and the US literally calling each other names. There's another parallel organization that I'll describe briefly later on called the Food Aid Convention. This is the one legal treaty that exists surrounding food aid. It was a very clever trick by the Johnson administration in the context of the Kennedy round negotiations of the GATT, the predecessor to the World Trade Organization. It was a clever trick, I say, because what really happened, how one should understand the Food Aid Convention, is that the U.S. induced the European countries to agree to provide a minimum guaranteed volume annually of food commodities they would contribute as food aid. Effectively, the commitment was to take product off the market to thereby help to reduce the price support payments the U.S. government had to make, because the Europeans were now effectively helping to cross-subsidize that by off-taking certain volumes of commodity from the global marketplace and thereby reducing commercial supply on the market and putting that food aid surplus that they were now taking off the market into low-income, non-market areas. So it's thought of on the principle of burden sharing that all donors are contributing. But the actual genesis, if you go back and you read the documentation behind the initial agreement in 1967 of the Food Aid Convention, this was really a very clever device to cross-subsidize American farm support costs in the context of trade negotiations that the Europeans desperately wanted to succeed. So the Food Aid Convention is the other pillar of the governance, the global governance of food aid, alongside the CSSD. It too is utterly dysfunctional today, giving rise to some of the disputes we see. Now, the disputes originate not just from the absence of effective global governance of food aid today. The disputes originate because there are multiple goals at play. I mean, U.S. food aid was created first and foremost as a surplus disposal mechanism, not as a mechanism initially for humanitarian relief. In fact, in the 1950s, less than 10% of food aid flows were targeted to respond to humanitarian emergencies. They were just regularly programmed flows, funny forms of budget support to developing country governments that were friendly with the United States and with Canada. Over time, especially since the world food crisis of the 70s, food aid has morphed into emergency response. It's a very different thing today than it was a long time ago. But there continue to be multiple donor goals. Surplus disposal, trade promotion. There's this conjecture that when you give away food, later on the recipients become commercial customers. And so the idea that's enshrined in the language of the original PL 480 is that this would be a trade promotion vehicle as well, not just a surplus disposal mechanism. Turns out it doesn't work, for reasons I'll explain shortly. It's also meant to support the maritime industry, which comes as a great shock to most people. Alongside PL 480, in 1954, the U.S. government enacted something called the Cargo Preference Act. The Cargo Preference Act stipulates that a minimum volume of U.S. donated commodities have to be shipped on U.S. flagged carriers. The purpose of the Cargo Preference Act is to ensure the viability of a private merchant marine fleet under U.S. control, under U.S. law with U.S. crews, so that it can be mobilized by the Department of Defense in time of war. And indeed, today, we've mobilized part of the merchant marine for assisting in Iraq. Now, the Cargo Preference Act initially required 50% of all food aid flows be on U.S. bottoms, as it's called. That was increased to 75% in 1985. That restriction drives up the cost of freight enormously. I'll give you a number shortly. But this objective of using food aid as a device to keep the private maritime interests viable is a really important impediment. And finally, food aid has always been used as an instrument of geopolitical leverage. Most recently, this is obvious in negotiations with the North Koreans. The Democratic People's Republic of Korea is one of the largest food aid recipients today, although there's no mechanism in place to evaluate its efficacy. The North Koreans don't permit surveys of recipient populations, much less treatment and control type designs. They insist on delivery to the North Korean government, and it's very hard to track where it ultimately goes, et cetera. I mean, nobody really expects the efficacy to be particularly high, but it's a really important instrument of diplomacy. So the U.S. government continues to contribute significant volumes of food aid to North Korea, primarily for diplomatic purposes. Food for talks, as I like to term it. Now, the problem here is that food aid that's trying to meet multiple objectives at the same time violates a very basic principle in economics. Jan Tinbergen, a Dutch economist who won the first Nobel Prize in economics, is famous for the Tinbergen Principle, which says you need one policy instrument for every policy objective. As soon as you start tying multiple objectives up in the same instrument, you're almost certainly going to wind up underperforming significantly. And so this clearly violates the Tinbergen Principle. We're trying to advance maritime interests, surplus disposal interests, commercial trade promotion interests, humanitarian interests, and geopolitical stroke diplomacy objectives, all with the same tool. It should be no surprise it doesn't reach its potential in achieving development and humanitarian aims. Moreover, we make the case it fails in meeting any of the other objectives. So relaxing these other constraints and focusing food aid tightly on its humanitarian and development objectives, for which it's demonstrably effective. We've got lots of evidence that food aid helps to increase children's anthropometric measures, that it accelerates children's growth velocity, that it reduces recipients' propensity to have to liquidate productive assets in time of crisis, etc. It works for that objective. It doesn't work for the others. So our argument is get rid of these other objectives and focus the resource tightly on the one goal for which it works. Now the problem is that that's not a popular position. Simply put, I'm not a popular person in the food aid corridors in Washington right now. The system remains heavily dominated by U.S. food aid, so U.S. food aid reforms is where all the action is. Most of the other donors have actually reformed much of their food aid programming. Kind of the last straw was the Canadians, who made a major reform in September, announcing they were not going to require 90% of their food aid shipments to be bought in Canada as they used to. Now they're only requiring half to be bought in Canada. That's a major relaxation of Canadian food aid programming. The EU has relaxed all its rules. Australia has significantly reformed its rules. The Japanese are a holdout for arcane reasons, not worth discussing unless somebody really wants to get into Japanese food aid policy. So the bottom line is the action in global food aid is all around U.S. programs, because U.S. programs have not reformed, and the U.S. represents 60% of global food aid contributions. I claim that the big impediment here is, the big impediment in making progress in U.S. food aid reforms is the existence of a number of really important and quite widely held myths. People generally believe several assertions to be true when in fact we can demonstrate they're false. And as soon as we get people to begin understanding and accepting that certain fundamental claims about food aid just aren't true, we notice that support for doing business the old way melts away somewhat. This is part of the history of reforms in Canada, that as the case was made gradually but steadily of the failings of Canadian food aid, Canadian farm groups actually became the big engines behind reforming the system, saying that we recognize we don't get anything out of this as farmers. This doesn't change the prices we get. This doesn't really affect the profitability of our farms, but we care about food and we care about efficiency, and therefore we want to see this done right. And when the farmers started agitating for reforms to the system, things moved quite quickly. So we remain hopeful that as we can shed some light on important myths, we might be able to make progress. And this is especially important because we're increasingly seeing serious, complex emergencies. You know, right now we've got Darfur that many people are very aware of. We've got ongoing problems related to conflict in Iraq and Afghanistan and several other places. You're soon going to be seeing distressing CNN images in the Horn of Africa and Southern Africa again. My email this morning from a postdoc in southern Ethiopia reports that of survey households we've been following for some time, it looks like about 40 to 50% of the herds have died in the last 4 months during the severe drought that's been hitting the Horn of Africa, Somalia, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Kenya. I mean, we've got, and according to WFP numbers right now, there are 14 million people at risk of famine in Ethiopia alone right now. You know, we've got a lot of these emergencies continuously cropping up. Getting the system to work better than it is working right now is increasingly important. So the key is the U.S. programs. This graphic depicts the history of U.S. programs, if you can see it. The big blue mass is something called Title I, which is the old-fashioned food aid run by USDA, where we actually sell the food aid. It's not a grant. It's a discounted loan program, government to government. And the key take-home message about Title I is that it's going to zero fast. It's fallen by 90% in inflation-adjusted terms since 1980, and indeed the budget the president released yesterday proposes to zero it out entirely. So food aid as it was known in the past, 1950s food aid, which is what the blue mass is, almost all of it in the 1950s and early 60s was Title I. That's essentially a relic of the past. That's being closed out. What's taken over is the red mark here called Title II, which is grant food aid. There's no sale involved, run by USAID, in particular by the Food for Peace Office, which is responding primarily to emergencies. A portion of it is for project food aid, as it's called, which is things like maternal and child health programs, school feeding programs, other sorts of things that aren't responses to emergencies per se, but that are responses to chronic need among identifiable subpopulations. So the story of U.S. food aid is a dramatic transformation since 1980, the last quarter century, from what used to be program food aid, government-to-government sales, discounted sales, that were intended for surplus disposal and trade promotion purposes, conversion into emergency response and investment in development, using food as a resource for programming like school feeding programs thought to have very high human returns. Not everybody is caught up to this change. The Europeans still think of most U.S. food aid as Title I, which creates a real challenge in WTO negotiations right now, that they're often talking past each other. So with that backdrop of how has U.S. food aid changed, let me start tackling the myths that I promised I would come to. So the first myth, and perhaps the most important one, is that U.S. food aid is actually an effective form of support for farmers. When you read the press reports about food aid battles, they routinely talk about how farm interests are worried that farmers are going to be hurt by U.S. food aid program changes. Well, that's pretty much impossible because farmers aren't helped by the present food aid arrangements. The simple reason is this: the U.S. food aid program is far too small to make any difference to the prices received by farmers. Think back to the design of the program in the 1950s. Farmers were benefiting, demonstrably benefiting from price support programs that set a floor on their incomes. As a result, surpluses were generated that the U.S. government shipped overseas as food aid. So there's a very strong correlation between government assistance to farmers and food aid flows. This is a classic case of people conflating correlation with causality. People then interpret that food aid helps farmers. But in fact, food aid was the product of help to farmers. Today, we don't have those surpluses. Today, when we have a food aid program, we go out through the regular government invitation for bids process. We solicit bids from vendors. We procure commodities and procure freight services to comply with the Cargo Preference Act, match those up, buy the food, hire the vessels, ship the stuff abroad. So we're out making open market purchases. But those open market purchases are tiny compared to the marketplace. Let me put this in perspective. My wife and I have 5 kids. We live in Lansing. Our purchasing power with a family of 7 as a share of the food market of Lansing and Ithaca is a little bit greater than that of the U.S. food aid program in the $1 trillion U.S. food market. So if you think that U.S. food aid moves prices for American farmers, you must also believe that the grocery store marks up prices when my wife and I show up to feed our horde. You plainly don't believe the grocer does that. So why would you believe that U.S. food aid programs move prices for American farmers? They don't. There are a couple of very minor exceptions to that for weird specialty products, but as a general rule of thumb, there's just no price effect. So there's no income effect for farmers. That's an important, important myth. Because there are only a small group of companies, only 4 companies sold more than half of the food aid into the U.S. government in the last couple of years. And you can figure out who most of these are. It's the big guys. And those 4 companies and the broader suite of large agribusinesses that are selling into the system don't really want to market food aid as something that helps their bottom line, especially the privately held companies. They want to market this as something that helps American farmers, to appeal to the populist image that is always a good political move, especially in the run-up to Iowa caucuses. So the myth of helping the American farmer is a central myth underpinning a system that underperforms its potential. Food aid doesn't help farmers. Shippers are the other big winners here. So it's not just that it helps a few big agribusinesses, because frankly, they make above average profits. We estimate about 8% above market by doing statistical analyses of open market prices and food aid procurement prices. The big winners are the shippers because of the Cargo Preference Act. So the GAO, the U.S., back then it was called the General Accounting Office. Now it's Government Accountability Office. GAO estimated in the early 90s about a 65% premium, about a 65% markup on freight costs due to cargo preference. We updated those numbers for 1999-2000 data and found that this had increased to almost 80%, 75 to 80%. These bar graphs give you some of the simple comparisons in terms of dollars per ton shipped. Dollar per ton shipped. So the point here is that there are a small handful of private corporations, large agribusinesses, and there are only 13 shipping firms registered as vendors for food aid shipping with the U.S. government. So a very small number of shipping lines involved in this as well. They're the ones who are winning from this, not U.S. farmers. So this myth of who is it that's benefiting from present procurement systems is really important to underpinning the politics of food aid. Second important myth is that a dollar spent on food aid is a dollar's worth of food into the mouths or bowls of hungry people. This is the point that I find really rattles farmers. Farmers survive on a very thin margin, and they work really hard to be incredibly efficient at what they do. And by and large, most of them are. And when they find out that last year the U.S. government spent $1.6 billion on food aid, of which $654 million, 40%, was for commodities. The remaining nearly $1 billion was for freight and for administration and for storage. 60% of the bill was not for commodities. And of that 40%, only a portion of it is for the physical commodity because there are also legal restrictions on how much you can ship in bulk. So there are minima for how much must be bagged and processed. So those value-added activities consume a portion of the commodity bill. And so the idea that a taxpayer dollar is generating 40 cents of food in the bowls of hungry people really bothers some people. This isn't a terribly efficient way of delivering food to poor people. I'll come back to some alternative mechanisms for delivering food to poor people in a moment. So by our calculations, and you can't see all of this here, and the book explains how we do this, of every dollar spent on food aid, about 5 cents of the dollar is a premium, an above average, above market level profit that goes to the vendors selling the commodities. About 27 cents is the open market cost of freight. Even in a competitive market, more than a quarter of the bill is just to move grain from the U.S. to Africa or Asia. A little bit more than another 20 cents is the premium, the markup that the freight vendors get, the shipping lines get. And then the remainder is the value of the food delivered. So this is how the spoils of food aid are being broken out. The recipients get the bulk of it. They get the largest single slice, but they don't even get half of the total dollar. The 40% figure in these numbers don't exactly match because they're from different years, for those of you who are quickly checking my math. Next myth, that the NGOs, like CARE that my co-author works for, are the big progressive force behind food aid. NGOs do incredibly valuable work in the field. And they have pioneered an awful lot of operational improvements. So improved targeting methods, early warning systems, some innovations in supply chain management, a variety of really important innovations can be credited to several innovative NGOs. It's simply not true, however, that the NGOs are out there pushing to make this system as responsive as possible to recipient need. And there's a very simple reason for this. Their budgets are at risk. Food aid is an enormous portion of the gross revenues of the major NGOs you're familiar with in the United States. You can't see the numbers here, unfortunately. TechnoServe, more than half of its gross revenues in 2001 were food aid. Almost all of which, by the way, was monetized. Monetization is the process whereby an NGO accepts delivery of food commodities, turns around and sells them in the marketplace, takes the cash proceeds and goes and does whatever valuable programming it's doing. So It's a funny way of taking a taxpayer dollar, buying commodities, shipping them halfway around the world to convert them back into cash. So taking $1 and converting it into 40 cents cash. It's not a very efficient mechanism for generating cash for NGOs. They do it because they can't get cash through the regular appropriations process. If food is the only form in which resources are available, you'll take it knowing full well it's very inefficient. Privately, every NGO will tell you that they really dislike monetization. They wish they'd just get a check. But publicly, they will defend to the death food aid for the purpose of monetization because they don't have much confidence that the Congress is going to give them cash for school programs or maternal child health clinics or things like that. So monetization, which by law was pegged at 10% up until the 1990 Farm Bill, and then that became a minimum for monetization, the idea being you have to sell off part of it to cover transport and storage and handling costs in the country, in the destination country. It became a minimum, knocked up to 15% in 1998. But the NGOs quickly figured out, minimum means we could sell more of it. We don't have to sell just that amount. We could get more food and sell more of it and have more cash to do interesting and important programming. And so non-emergency food aid exploded in monetization. So in 2001, more than 70% of all non-emergency Title II food aid was being monetized by NGOs. So it wasn't being distributed as food, as most on the Hill still believe to this day. Today, monetization has fallen down a little bit. As we started to release these numbers, people started to get a little nervous, and NGOs began rolling back some monetization programs. CARE has just released a white paper last fall saying it's going to get out of the business of monetization. Save the Children and Catholic Relief Services are likewise backing off monetization somewhat. But this use of commodities just to generate cash, quite inefficient way of transferring cash around the world has attracted a lot of tension, not least of which among trade partners. Because think about what monetization means. An NGO is showing up in a market and dumping food into the market as a vendor. There are lots of really good and talented people in NGOs, but there aren't a lot of good grain traders working for NGOs. One of my favorite quotes in working on food aid comes from talking with a serious agribusiness dealer in Nairobi who said, I don't mind competing with NGOs, I just mind that they're so stupid about how they compete with me. Because they don't understand pricing, they don't understand any of the financial underpinnings of grain trading. They come up with very clumsy contracts for storage. They don't help to stabilize the market. They often disrupt the market by not handling monetization particularly gracefully. That's not uniformly true, and interestingly, NGOs have moved towards hiring retired grain traders. CRS and Save the Children in particular have some really outstanding old agribusiness types now working in their field offices doing an excellent job with monetization. But that's just a distortion of your staffing to deal with the resource. Monetization, therefore, becomes an issue not just in terms of the efficiency by which we move money from here to developing countries. It also is an issue then for the possible disruption and demonstrable disruption in many cases of local markets with adverse effects for local businesses and for third countries trying to sell into those markets. So these NGOs, heavily dependent in their budgets on food aid as a basic resource to underpin their operations, have been very, very reluctant to push for reforms. And in particular, they've been reluctant to push for reforms of things like monetization because they're fearful that there's not a constituency out there to support the provision of cash as a substitute for this clumsy second best resource that they're taking right now. So the result is that last year, when the White House and USAID proposed to take 1/4 of the food aid budget and to relax the requirement that you buy the food in the United States and ship it from the United States, and instead allow the U.S., as all other donors do, to buy food closer to the destination, what's called local and regional purchases, to buy locally, buy in a surplus region in Kordofan in Sudan to distribute in a different region, Darfur, for example. Because markets don't work particularly well in much of the developing world, and you can buy in one localized segmented market where there's a surplus and distribute quite nearby where there's a deficit. This can happen much faster, much lower cost than transoceanic shipments that have big delays, as I'll show you. The White House was blindsided because the NGOs opposed this. The White House expected NGOs are going to like the idea of reducing the waste on freight, of accelerating deliveries, because this is all something that helps people in emergencies. Instead, the NGOs came out in opposition to this because they didn't want to rock the boat. They're very worried about upsetting the shippers and the agribusiness that support present food aid arrangements and thereby losing the only resource they're getting. It's not a perfect resource, but it's better than nothing. Next myth, another myth for the food aid, for the agribusiness community, that food aid actually creates future commercial export markets. The image that the North American Millers Association gave me several years ago, someone there told me, well, it's sort of like a try one free coupon deal. You know, you get these coupons in the mail, go try Ben & Jerry's new flavor or whatever, and you rush out because, hey, you're getting free ice cream. And obviously they're not giving you this because they want you to feel good. They want you to go buy the stuff after you've tried it once and liked it. So the program was characterized back in the 1950s when PL 480 was launched as a device for building future markets, for changing people's tastes and thereby creating future export markets. Well, that's a testable hypothesis, and it turns out when you take that claim to data that it's just not true. And if you think about it, it's not surprising, because the commodity vendors are selling their food anyway. They just sell it to the US government instead of selling it to foreign customers. Who is easier to sell to, the US government or to supermarket chains halfway around the world, or governments or NGOs halfway around the world? The US government. It's a lot easier to sell to. So commercial vendors of food have an incentive not to get out of the food aid system and have to go compete for contracts with foreign purchasers. They would rather continue to sell into the food aid system. Either way, they're getting paid. And as a result, we see tremendous persistence in food aid programming. Once a country starts receiving food aid, the probability that it continues to receive food aid another year is greater than 90%, no matter how long it has been receiving US food aid, out to horizons of 25 years. You can have been receiving food aid for 25 years, and the conditional probability of receiving food aid the next year is still more than 90%. Extraordinary persistence in this program because the incentives aren't there for the vendors to delink. As a result, it doesn't build commercial markets, it just perpetuates food aid sales through the same arrangements. The next myth, food aid responds in timely fashion to emergencies. This is a plot of the delivery lags, defined very conservatively as the difference between port delivery, and people don't show up at port with their bowls collecting food. So the difference between port delivery and the bureaucratic call forward, the formal government requisition for food. So this is a significant understatement of the true lags involved. But this is a plot of the density of delivery lags in emergency shipments. This isn't non-emergency. This is emergency shipments. The median delivery lag is 139 days. Nearly 5 months to reach destinations in times of emergency. This is the primary reason why I agitate for local and regional purchases. It's not efficiency reasons, it's response, timeliness of response. In emergency medicine, there's a very basic principle, the golden hour. You have 60 minutes from the onset of a severe medical condition, an injury, during which time appropriate medical attention has a very high probability of being able to save somebody's life, or at least be able to leave them in a state from which they'll be able to recover in time. If you get beyond 60 minutes, the rule of thumb is in emergency medicine, you've got real problems on your hands. The golden hour principle is severely violated by the delivery lags we face in contemporary food aid programming. So the golden hour is basically being opposed by and disrupted by what I term the iron triangle of the 3 big interests that underpin food aid: the agribusinesses, the shippers, and the NGOs. So that basic triad, that iron triangle of interest in contemporary U.S. food aid policy, has been historically the opponent of relaxation of laws that would enable us to have much more flexible, much more timely, and much less costly response. Now, it's worth noting that the U.S. response is slow because we have these domestic procurement and shipping rules. So you have to go to Kansas to get your grain, and you have to hire a U.S. flagged vessel to ship it halfway around the world. The EU has relaxed those rules. So they like to make quite a show of the fact that they now provide cash for local and regional purchases. The cruel irony is the EU is even slower than the U.S. is to get resources into country, simply because of horrific bureaucracies. So, for instance, last year in Niger, many of you remember the horrible images last summer from Niger. U.S. food aid was arriving on scene long before EU food aid for the simple reason that the EU couldn't get around to writing checks. The U.S. was able to divert some ships at sea intended for other destinations and get grain and get skim milk powder and corn soy blend and such things, even to airlift food into Niger. And so U.S. food was the first on the scene, even though it took a long time, simply because of the bureaucracy of the agencies. So it's not that U.S. food is relatively slow compared to other donors, it's that it's relatively slow compared to what we can do when we relax the rules for procurement a bit. The next myth is that food aid creates dependency, that it creates these massive disincentive effects for recipient country farmers. And the idea is very appealing and simple to understand for anybody who's at Economics 101. You bring food aid in, the supply curve shifts out. When the supply curve shifts out, as long as there's any downward slope to a demand curve, prices fall. If prices fall, that means that local farmers get less. And if local farmers are getting less, their incentives to invest in improving their productivity falls, et cetera, and so you have this vicious cycle by which food aid retards the agricultural development of recipient countries. Very clean, neat theory. Unfortunately, it too isn't true. Or it's not true everywhere, I should say. One of the critical things to keep in mind about poor farmers is that they're typically constrained by their cash availability. When you provide food to a farmer who doesn't have the cash to buy seed or hire workers, you free him up from having to buy food during his lean season. And what we see is that there's a direct response that farmers who are receiving food aid, small farmers in Africa, in parts of Latin America where there's been empirical work done on this, respond by increasing their purchase of inputs. If they buy more fertilizer, they buy modern seed that they otherwise forego, they hire more workers, they get a bigger harvest several months later. So in recent estimates that we've published, we actually find in sub-Saharan Africa as a whole using macro data, as well as in Ethiopia using very specific seasonal data from households, there's actually, if anything, a positive supply response in the wake of food aid distribution to small farmers. That rather than the positive negative effect, the dependency disincentives effect, there might even be a slight positive effect because food aid, well targeted to relieve these constraints, food aid showing up to people who are hungry and who need food at a time when they're really stressed for resources, actually relaxes some of the constraints that impedes their productivity. So this is an important issue, especially for developing countries. Many recipient governments oppose food aid because they believe the myth about disincentive effects. It's true if you just dump the food into the market. You just drive prices down then. But if you can deliver food, if you can target it and deliver it to poor people who face liquidity constraints, you can demonstrably increase productivity rather than reduce it. So once we bundle up all these various findings as we've explored different issues surrounding food aid, where do we come out in terms of using food aid? There are really three big justifications for food aid ultimately, once you sit down and go through the analysis and look at the objectives and what it really is effective at accomplishing. The first and major objective where food aid needs to be targeted is short-term humanitarian assistance to food insecure populations, emergency response. Secondly is safety nets, so as to ensure people don't have to liquidate assets. Let me explain what I mean by a safety net. So several governments run employment guarantee schemes. Rains fail, or better yet, something idiosyncratic, specific to a farmer. There's a pest infestation in a particular little corner that wipes out crop for one farmer. He's going to go hungry now or have to sell off his assets to migrate to town and try to survive. Programs that exist that guarantee jobs for those who need them at low wages are very effective at impeding the liquidation of productive assets by people who suffered shocks. The big problem here is most governments don't have the resources to underpin employment guarantee schemes. So big governments do. The Indian governments run employment guarantee schemes for quite some time. The Maharashtra Employment Guarantee Scheme in particular is well known and well documented to provide pretty effective social insurance. But there have been programs in a variety of places. The typical problem is that they get designed and resourced only after a wide-scale problem has begun, by which time many people have already fallen through the holes in that safety net. So providing food aid that helps to underpin ongoing, continuing safety nets is a very valuable use of the resource and seems to work. There are a few but limited cases where you can use food aid as a resource to underpin development, where you use it for school feeding programs or to try to help develop agribusinesses. So for instance, part of the Indian smallholder dairy market was developed by distributing skim milk powder donated by the Europeans to small farmer dairy co-ops that would then literally liquefy the powder, sell it, use the capital to invest in equipment, coolers and other sorts of processing equipment that could then underpin a sustainable smallholder dairy co-op. So there are some cases where food aid has been effectively used for such things. In general, as an economist, I feel we don't have very good evidence that that's a relatively effective use of the cash. Typically, the opportunity cost is pretty high, meaning if we put the money into other interventions, I conjecture we get higher returns typically for development. Food is mainly useful for humanitarian assistance and safety nets in a few limited cases for those sorts of development actions. But the big things are that food aid really works only when there's a problem of food availability. When there just isn't enough food in an area and the markets don't work. If markets work, put cash into the system. Give people jobs for cash, and they'll go to their local markets, they'll go to local traders, and traders are very resourceful and will find a way to get the food when the markets work reasonably well. When markets don't work, then you have to bring in food, and the question becomes, from whence do you procure it? Do you get it there through local and regional purchases, through another part of the country or a neighboring country, or do you have to go halfway around the world as we presently do? Unfortunately, that's not the decision tree we use right now. So one of the things we've been pushing with operational agencies is a simple decision tree like this. How do we decide how we address a given chronic problem or especially a given emergency? The first question is, are the markets functioning well? If yes, don't send food aid. Get cash into the system. Increase people's purchasing power. Food will naturally flow to where the cash is. If the food markets don't work very well, then you need to get food. If there's not sufficient food available locally, you got to provide it based on intercontinental shipments. If it is available locally, then the quick and cheap way typically is local and regional purchases. So this sort of simple decision tree is a reasonable way of underscoring that we're not talking about get rid of the procurement of food in the United States for these purposes, but rather target it for the very specific context in which you really need to bring resources halfway around the world. As the joke in parts of rural Ethiopia goes, an old farmer and a young farmer are standing next to each other, and the young farmer is worried, I'm not sure if the rains are going to fall, and his more experienced neighbor says, don't worry about that. What you need to worry about is whether it rains in Canada and the United States. Because the default is to source it halfway around the world, and that's not always appropriate. I've taken longer than I wanted to. Let me just briefly outline. I mentioned that I talk about international governance of food aid. I won't go into details. As I mentioned before, there are a couple of different arrangements out there, the CSSD, the Food Aid Convention, which are utterly ineffective today, unfortunately. They're to be renegotiated. The CSSD is almost certainly to be closed down after we get the next WTO agreement. The December Hong Kong ministerial dictates that the members will agree on modalities with respect to food aid by 30 April. I wouldn't hold your breath until 30 April, but we'll probably see some sort of agreement later in 2006, at which point you will see renegotiation of the Food Aid Convention. We've got a proposal outlined in the book and fleshed out in more detail in the next issue of Food Policy that proposes something called the Global Food Aid Compact that outlines a strategy for addressing food aid within the WTO, nesting the legal obligations under the Food Aid Convention Treaty in a way that will both reduce commercial disruption of markets through food aid wrongly used while ensuring the preservation of food aid as a resource for meeting humanitarian needs. Simply outlined, the basic idea is in the WTO jargon, green box means everything's okay. Blue box means we're not sure about this, we need to monitor it, but we aren't going to restrict it. Amber box means slow down and get ready to stop this. And the basic, simple way of understanding what we propose is that emergency food aid of any sort should always be permitted, no restrictions. The prospective price in humanitarian terms of disrupting food aid responding to emergencies is simply too great to worry about its likely very small commercial market displacement effects. When you start talking about non-emergency food aid, if it's untied, meaning that it's not obliged to be purchased in the donor country, you can do cash for local and regional purchases, is untied food aid. Untied food aid, likewise, is not a problem. It's unlikely to disrupt markets. But once you get to tied food aid for non-emergencies, so the non-emergency U.S. food aid programs, particular components of the Japanese, Australian, and Canadian programs that are non-emergency and still tied to domestic procurement, if you can target those effectively to poor people, then the humanitarian benefits outweigh the prospective market disruption costs. The objective is to convert those resources to maintain the value of flows, and there are a variety of technical and legal details of how you can do that we map out in the paper. But the key thing here is to preserve food aid, but to focus it on its legitimate humanitarian objectives for which it's demonstrably effective, and to shut down the use of food aid for purposes for which it not only doesn't succeed, but because you're trying to meet unattainable objectives with a resource, you impede its effectiveness in meeting humanitarian and development objectives. So the only thing food aid used for surplus disposal and export promotion purposes succeeds in is achieving some political warm glow. So the big events where we see misuse of food aid are called even-numbered year events, because we hold elections in this country in even-numbered years. So we see massive program food aid shipments to Russia in 1992 and 1998 that caused all sorts of problems and are very hard to defend on humanitarian or nutritional grounds. We see similar sorts of programs that seem to recur, curiously enough, in even-numbered years. And simply tying one's hands in subjecting oneself to the discipline of pre-committing that I'm not going to be able to do this provides an effective out politically for, the law no longer lets me do this, so I can't go up and mop up corn-soy blend and just dump it someplace so that I can say I helped you. Skip through that. So just to conclude, at the end of the day, what we're trying to do in this book is make an evidence-based case for a reform of food aid, not to do away with food aid. I really need to underscore that because I'm constantly characterized by the food aid community as anti-food aid and I'm trying to shut the programs down. That's not at all it. What we want to do is we want to recognize that food aid is essential in the battle to reduce hunger and poverty, but you need faster, you need more flexible emergency response, you need to use the resource more efficiently than we presently do. All of this requires some relatively simple reforms to the way we program food aid, especially in the United States. You need to decouple it from its other donor-oriented objectives for which it doesn't succeed, it doesn't expand markets, it doesn't support farm prices and farmer incomes, it doesn't do many of these things people claim. It doesn't even succeed in preserving the maritime industry in the United States. I mean, the maritime fleet in the United States, especially the bulk carrying capacity, has shrunk by more than 3/4 in 25 years. So it may be slowing the decline a little bit, but it's certainly not stopping it. So it doesn't meet these other objectives. It doesn't succeed, so let's focus it on the one thing it does well, and by doing that, to make it much more efficient. The big battle isn't going to be the budget battle that began yesterday. The big battle is going to be the Farm Bill. The WTO isn't even the big battle, although it's going to frame the Farm Bill. If we get sensible reforms in the context of the Doha Round agreement later this year, that will constrain what we can do in the Farm Bill on food aid and hopefully constrain it in a positive way. Finally, once the WTO arrangements are struck, there's going to need to be serious attention paid to redesign of the global governance architecture that surrounds food aid, so that there are rules that are internationally understood and abided by, and there are effective enforcement mechanisms that will ensure that people don't misuse food aid for purposes that don't advance its humanitarian and development objectives, and thereby disrupt markets, which ultimately impedes development. So I thank you for your time. I'm happy to take questions or comments. I have no idea what the timing is supposed to be. Perhaps Janet can. Thank you. Are we? Okay.